morning. That's where we'll take our study from, Mark chapter 2. We're going to pull a brief episode from the life of Jesus and work with that a little while this morning. You might think of that in context with our Bible reading for 2020. We're making our way through the Gospels, and to the end that we might understand Jesus better. And so we're going to narrow that focus down to a very specific incident and a critical lesson, I think, for you and I as disciples that we need to pull out of this. So I'm in Mark 2. Will you look at verse 14? That's where we'll start. Mark 2, verse 14, where the text says, "As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax booth, and he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he got up and followed him. And it happened that Jesus was reclining at the table in his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were dining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many of them, and they were following him. When the scribes and the Pharisees saw that he was eating with tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, 'Why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners?' And hearing this, Jesus said to them, 'It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners.'" This story, I think, exposes one of the aspects of Jesus' work that is unexpected, to say the least, to the people of his day, one of the most objectionable parts of his ministry. And I think for you and I, looking back on it, one that poses a great challenge to me and you. Isn't it interesting that what you have in Jesus is deity who has come from heaven to earth to live among men? And yet while he is here, isn't it interesting that God on earth doesn't live in some amazing palace somewhere where he's tended to by all of these servants and visited by all the important dignitaries in the world? I think if you and I were thinking about what the coming of God to earth would look like, that is probably the kind of thing most of us would imagine. But that is not at all what we find when we read the Gospels, is it? In fact, more often than not, when we find Jesus interacting with people, often he is interacting not with the important people, but with the unimportant. In fact, more than that, with the rejects, with the objectionable people. In fact, so much was that the case that it ultimately became an accusation that the enemies of Jesus launched against him. They said about him that he is the friend of tax collectors and sinners. And we see that here in Mark chapter 2. And so for a little while this morning, I'd like for you to think with me about this accusation and what it was about Jesus that caused his enemies to say this about him, and then to work with that and figure out maybe some things that you and I should take away from it and learn about this unexpected thing we encounter about Jesus as we learn about him in the gospel record. So, why did they call him the friend of tax collectors and sinners? Let me say four things about that. First of all, I think they called him that because Jesus sought out these people. Jesus sought to be in the company of tax collectors and sinners. If you look back to our text in Mark chapter 2, that's exactly what we find going on here. What we have is Jesus calling Levi, also known as who, do you know? Matthew, the author of one of the Gospels we're reading this year. This is Levi or Matthew, the tax collector that Jesus calls to be a follower. Ultimately, he's going to be one of the apostles. And you and I hear that and we think, yeah, Matthew the apostle. That is not the way that people in his day would have responded to this. The call of Matthew to be one of the close companions of Jesus was a bizarre choice to the people of that culture. Tax collectors were notoriously dishonest people. It was a weird tax code. Citizens pretty much depended on the tax collector to tell them what they owed. And so it lent itself to dishonesty. If you were a dishonest tax collector, what you do is you go to Greg and you say, you owe this much, which is a lot more than what he really owed. And so you take what Greg pays, you pay the government their portion, and what do you do with the rest? You pocket it. That's exactly right. And that's how the systems worked. The tax collectors could take advantage of the citizens, and they knew they were being taken advantage of. They just couldn't do anything about it. And so is that fact, the fact that they were dishonest, and the fact that they were closely connected with the Roman authorities, who the Jews hated, that made tax collectors despised by the people. Now, with that context, think about what's going on here. Jesus chooses as one of his closest companions one of these dishonest tax collectors. And it's worse than that. Because if you look back to Mark 2, down at verse number 15, Matthew hosts some kind of a gathering for Jesus in his home. And while he is there, he invites all of these other tax collectors to come eat as well, all of his friends. And so here is Jesus right smack dab in the middle of all of these corrupt people. It was a bizarre scene. And yet, brothers and sisters, I would submit to you that when you look at the life of Jesus, what you find is that it is not an unusual scene. Because that's often where you find the Lord, in the middle of a bunch of corrupt people. For example, in Luke chapter 19, in verse 5, Jesus invites himself to stay in the home of that wealthy chief tax collector, Zacchaeus, the ones that the kids have the song about, right? And then there's that scene in John chapter 4 where he encounters the disreputable woman at the well near the city of Sychar. You would think that a proper man would have just let that awkward moment where she comes to draw water while he's there, that he would have just let the moment pass. But Jesus does the opposite. He works very hard to get over all the barriers between them to have a conversation with her. In Matthew 26 and verse 6, he's eating in the home of Simon the leper. And even if we grant by this point his leprosy is cured, no respectable Jew would ever find himself in such a place. He chose as his closest companions this tax collector, Levi, and a bunch of Galilean fishermen, and a zealot numbered among the women who followed him was a woman who had been demon-possessed. I mean, start looking for it, folks. It's everywhere. So what's the point? He sought out the company of society's outcasts. The reason he is called the friend of sinners is because he sought out the sinners and sought to be among them and be with them. But the more we probe this, the more interesting it gets, is because not only did Jesus seek them out, but the second thing I want you to notice is this, is that they sought him out too. So go back to our text in Mark 2, because we see that in this story as well. In Mark chapter 2, notice in verse 15, right at the end of verse 15, it's talking about all these tax collectors he's dining with. And at the end of verse 15, it says, for there were many of them, and do you see the rest of it? They were following him. Evidently, Jesus is not just interested in them, but they are interested in him too. And isn't that interesting? That these wicked, sinful people wanted to be in the company of Jesus. Going back to the story of Zacchaeus, that's why Jesus had an opportunity to invite himself to Zacchaeus' home. He had come out to see Jesus. Y'all remember the story? He had to climb up in the tree, right? Because he couldn't see him. Hobbit issues, baby. I guess he's a little like my wife, too short to see. There's a more dramatic example of that, though, I think, in Luke chapter 7, when Jesus has been invited into the home of the Pharisee, one of the Pharisees, to eat. And while he is there is this woman, a disreputable woman, a woman, let's just say, with a reputation. Is that a clear enough picture? Who comes into this Pharisee's home uninvited. She kneels at the feet of Jesus and she begins to wash his feet with her tears and dry them with her hair. we have a hard time getting past that. That just seems kind of bizarre. I want you to think about another dimension of that story. I want you to think about the fact that this woman is there in the home of this Pharisee. She has come to a place where she knows, where everyone knows, she is not welcome. She is not supposed to be there. The Pharisee, whose house it is, he didn't want her there. And yet that's exactly where she comes, so that she can honor Jesus in this way. What was it in her soul that drove her to violate all the social norms and to go where she wasn't welcome, to honor Jesus in this way? What powerful forces must have driven her to do that? Luke 15 and verse 1 says that all of the tax collectors and sinners were coming to him. Now let's be clear about something. These people did not seek out Jesus because they found in Jesus someone who would support their wicked lifestyle, or someone who was willing to overlook all of that. They did not find any kind of endorsement in Jesus for the evil that they were doing. In fact, what we see is just the opposite. In Mark 2 and verse 17, Jesus acknowledges that these tax collectors he's gathered with, they're sinners. That's why he's talking to them. He would say of the woman in Luke chapter 7, he would say that her sins were many. He's not overlooking the evil that they were doing. In fact, it does not appear that they came to Jesus because they believed somehow he would endorse their lifestyle. In fact, it seems to be just the opposite. That they know how spiritually destitute they are, and they come to Jesus because they see in him some kind of hope, some kind of answer for their messed up lives. And I think that's unexpected too, especially for us in the culture we live in. Wicked, sinful people in our culture have one of two reactions to the righteous. It is either that they despise righteous people, or they are ashamed in the presence of righteous people. So I remember one time inviting a lady that I knew to come visit our worship service. And she sort of laughed me off when I said that. And she said this. She said, "David, if I came into your church building, that place would collapse on top of all of us." I have never forgotten that. And I got to tell you, folks, it torments my soul. I don't know how many thousands of people drive past this church building every single day. Dallin Road's a little bit busy, right? How many thousands of people drive past this church building? Maybe they're doing it right now, and they're looking at this place, and they're saying to themselves, that is not a place where I belong. And it makes me wonder, what is it that we're not doing right? Because the wicked sought out Jesus. Why do they not seek out us? Third, the enemies of Jesus saw this reality as an opportunity to criticize him. Going back to our text in Mark chapter 2, we see exactly the same thing. At the end of verse 16, when they see Jesus at this gathering, the scribes of the Pharisees want to know. They ask his disciples, why is he eating with these wicked people? And I love the response of Jesus. We'll dig a little deeper into that in just a minute. But it's a pattern we see throughout the gospel. That when Jesus associates with sinners, his enemies criticize him for it. Going back to Luke chapter 15, verse 1 says that all of the sinners are coming to him. But in verse 2, his enemies criticize him because these people are coming to him. It's what prompts the three parables in that story, the lost sheep and the lost coin and the prodigal son. It's the answer to the criticism. And again, I would say that is so unexpected. You would think that if anyone would celebrate sinners coming and being taught, it would have been the religious leaders of Jesus' day. But we see exactly the opposite in the gospel accounts. They are his sharpest critics. This is the accusation they make against him because he's doing that. And I don't think it's hard to figure out why. They didn't love these people. A leper was a diseased man to be avoided. A tax collector was a cheat and collaborator to be despised. The poor had nothing to offer. Why should I care about them? You see, his enemies refused to recognize what was most important about these people coming to Jesus. They were lost. They needed to be rescued. Which brings me to the fourth observation I want to make this morning, and that is this. Jesus sought these people for a reason. So can we be clear about that? It's not that the Lord is looking here for some people to hang out with on Friday night, and so he chooses to be in the company of sinners. That is not what this is about. Jesus sought these people out for a reason. Verse 17 back in Mark 2 tells us why. Are you still there? Look at Mark 2 and verse 17, where Jesus, answering his critics, says this. He said, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Do you catch what he's saying there? It's as though Jesus says, I am the great physician. Who did you think I was supposed to be spending time with? Healthy people? Physicians spend time with the sick. These are the sin sick. Whose company did you think that I ought to be in? I think Jesus saw what his enemies refused to see. I think he saw people at their most valuable level. They were souls that needed rescue. And so from whatever station of life men came to him, whether a poor beggar or a dishonest tax collector or a diseased leper or a self-righteous Pharisee, they were all the same. They were lost. They needed rescue. And when they were willing to come to him, Jesus received them all, every last one. So, you probably can get a sense that we can say a whole lot more about that. But we need to say a little bit about what that means for me and you. And so, can I wrap this up with 4 quick observations about how I think this dimension of Jesus' life and work ought to change me and you, change our perception in at least 4 different ways. I'm going to give those to you, and we're going to wrap up. Number 1, I think this reality should change the way that we see people. Because I think too often we are guilty of looking at people and seeing only what the Pharisees saw, looking and seeing people at their most trivial level. I think we make that mistake all the time. When we go into work tomorrow, what do we see? We see the person that is our coworker or the boss that runs our company. Or when we head over to H-E-B to try to buy some toilet paper today, what do we see? We see the clerk that's going to check us out. Or if you're really gutsy and you go to a restaurant for lunch today, it's the waiter who's going to wait on our table. We see people in terms of the relationship they sustain to us or what they're going to do for us, right? Or we look at people and all we see is their sin list. Do you ever do that? You look at that coworker and think, well, that's the guy that left his wife and ran off with one of the secretaries. Or that's the guy that parties all weekend long and has to come in on Mondays and give all of us this awful report of the terrible things he did over the weekend. Or that's a guy that's a homosexual. Is that what we see? Their sin list. I think what Jesus would want us to do is to appreciate is that there is something even more important about every person, more important about the relationship they sustain with us, whatever that is, more important than their sin list is the fact that every person is an eternal soul that is going to spend eternity somewhere, that is precious in the eyes of God. That is every person. And when Jesus looked at people, that's what he saw. And when we look at people, that's what we need to see. So, once our perception is changed, number 2, this is going to change the way we see our mission. What is our mission? I've answered that question a lot over the 3 decades I've been preaching, and ordinarily I would say something like, our mission is to go preach the gospel to our friends and neighbors. Have you ever said that? Ever heard someone say that? We're supposed to go preach the gospel to our friends and neighbors. Okay. So after studying this part of Jesus' life, I began to realize that that was really inadequate. That is not our mission, folks. If I go preach the gospel to my friends and neighbors, we're largely talking about middle-class Americans. Those are the people that surround me. That is not our mission, is it? Mark 16 and verse 15 does not say, go preach the gospel to your friends and neighbors. Who should we preach the gospel to according to Jesus? Every creature, right? Matthew 28:19, go preach the gospel to all the nations. We're supposed to teach everybody, anybody who will listen to us. And so, whether it's the president of the company that you work for or the guy that cleans the toilets, if you'll listen, we're supposed to talk to him. The star football player on your high school football team, or the biggest computer geek in your school that nobody will eat lunch with. If you'll listen, you need to talk to him. You know what we need to get out of the business of doing? Assuming we will know who will listen and who will not. We should talk to everybody. Number 3, this reality should change the way we see the church. You know, one of the cool things about the church ought to be that every person can find a place here. It's one of the unique places in our culture where every person has a place. If you have decided that you want to walk with Jesus and you are committed to doing that, there is a place for you in this family. It does not matter what your education is. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD or if you didn't finish elementary school. It doesn't matter if you make a whole lot of money or you don't know how you're paying for groceries next week. It doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter what your sin list looks like. You want to see a sin list? Grab some 1 Corinthians 9 or chapter 6. Look at verses 9 through 11. Look at some of the awful things that the Corinthians had done. And yet here they are, one big church family all together. That's who we're supposed to be. I remember years ago, this new convert was really struggling with gathering with God's people, and he finally confided in me. He said, you know, I go to church on Sunday, and I look around at all these people that are just so righteous and holy, and he said, David, I was in jail. And I laughed at him. I laughed out loud when he told me that. I said, yeah, and I noticed Sunday, you were sitting 2 rows behind a guy that got out 6 months ago. We all have a list. Terrible things we've done and regret. Once a person decides to turn from his past and follow Jesus, this is his family. He has a place here. At least, brothers and sisters, that's what God had in mind. Our challenge, we need to make sure it's what we have in mind too. Finally, it needs to change the way we see ourselves. Sometimes our perceptions of self get a little corrupted because of the honors and recognition that society heaps on you. So I don't know what you've done and what you've been recognized for. Maybe you've got some plaques to hang on your wall where the company you work for has acknowledged you, or maybe people think you're significant for some other reasons. I don't know for every person in this crowd what in our culture would make others say that you are important. But I will say this to you, that in the thing that matters most, brothers and sisters, all of us, every one of us, are in exactly the same place. You know what's important about me? You know who I am? And you'll want to get this because it's who you are too. I'm a sinner. And I need Jesus to rescue me, or I'm going to be lost forever. And in that most important way, we are all exactly the same. So make what you will of the plaques that hang on the wall or the honors that are attached to you. At the end of the day, and the only thing that really matters, all of us are exactly the same. And do you see how that changes the way we look at ourselves? I don't have any reason to lift myself up or think that I'm special or somehow above other people, because in the thing that matters, I'm not different than anyone else. There is one thing that separates men from each other. And it is that some have depended on Jesus for rescue. And some of us have not done that. So I'm going to tell you something you've heard me say before, and I'm going to close with this. When the great ship Titanic sailed, it had all kinds of different people on it, right? Who could categorize themselves in all kinds of different ways. There were some very wealthy people who sailed on the Titanic. And there were some people in those cabins way below the deck who had to scrape up the money just to come to America, okay? There were some very educated people for the time on that boat, and there were people who had no education at all. And there were important people on that boat whose names people still talk about today. And there are some people who were completely unknowns. You could take the registry of the people who sailed on the ship Titanic, and you could categorize those people in all kinds of different ways. But in the end of all of that, there were only two lists. The people who were saved and the people who were lost. And really, that's the way it is for all of us. Brothers and sisters, this ship is going down. And however we choose to categorize ourselves or attach significance to ourselves in this life, whatever places we put ourselves in, and however men may honor us, at the end of the day, when the ship goes down, there are two categories. People who are saved and people who are lost. So the question for me and you is, which list are you on? And the good news is that you can do something about that. If you are not with the Lord, if you have not depended on him for your salvation, if you're willing today to confess your faith in Jesus and to submit to his demand that you be baptized so that he can wash you clean of your sins, if you will do that, you can be numbered among those who will be saved when the ship goes down. You need to do that today? We'd love to help you make that choice. If you need to respond, make your way to the front right now while we stand, while we sing.